So if all you're looking at is this, it's pretty easy to transfer that market risk. But now let's look at some ways that they have transferred the default risk, again, from the few, from those guys at the top, to an unsuspecting public. And we're going to start with how the government does that. How did they transfer that default risk from private for-profit corporations to taxpayers? And we're going to use Greece as an example, Greek government bonds actually, because it's a perfect example of how that risk has been transferred. So first, this little gold area in here where it says official sector, that's taxpayers, okay? Taxpayers would be responsible for those Greek government bonds. All these other areas, though, are private corporations for profit. So before Greece, I can't say they default because the bank said it wasn't a default, but before they reset their government bonds to 90% within 1 year, guess what happened? They transferred the risk away from these private corporations onto the public's balance sheet by a pretty darn wide margin. You can see for yourself right here. So done and done. Default risk from corporations to taxpayers. Now we're going to look at how banks transfer default risk to investors. Because up until this point, the banks were loaning money to these corporations, to individuals, to whoever they wanted to. But you can see that has declined pretty rapidly. Both this is domestically and then this is foreign banks. They're not lending anymore. Can you see that? But somebody's got to pick up the slack. So here it is. It's the naive public. In their reach for yield, they've taken on a lot more risk while the banks have shed that risk. Done. Now let's look at the bail-in risk and how the banks have transferred that bail-in risk to savers. And we're going to go to Cyprus because Cyprus was the first bank where they tested the bail-in back in 2013. And this area, as you can see, are individual savers, and that's pretty much a straight line. People put their money in the bank. I mean, when was the last time that, you thought about closing out your bank account? No, you're in a habit and you stay there. This black line are EU banks. Well, goodness gracious, who didn't know that there was a problem with the Greek bonds in 2010? Do you think these European banks knew something that, I don't know, the general public didn't know? Of course they do. So this is, or at least 3 ways, that default risk has been transferred from the many to the few. Now we're going to look at how they have transferred the speculation risk, again, from the few to the many. Now, just to refresh in your memory, SIFI, S-I-F-I, stands for Systemically Important Financial Institution, which is something that you and I are not, okay? But according to the IMF, the most important systemic bank in the world and the most dangerous is Deutsche Bank. And you can see right here, this is Deutsche Bank's hub. And the IMF has labeled them as a global universal bank. Let me show you why. Number one, it's pretty easy to see how these spokes attach to all the global banks. And your bank, if you're with JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, etc., you can see that connection. But you see all these little gray lines underneath, kind of like a spider's web? That is showing you how they are tied to every single financial institution and every single financial product on the planet, okay? So that's why if Deutsche Bank sneezes, the world catches a cold. And let me tell you, Deutsche Bank is not very healthy. In their most current, I did a whole piece on that. It's on YouTube. It's in our archives. But they have the largest notional position of derivatives on the planet. Remember, we don't really know that word notional. You know, what's the real value at risk? Who knows? Nobody knows. But you can see how it dwarfs all the money that flows through the entire Eurozone. This is the Euro GDP, and certainly Germany's GDP. So how do you bail that out? But it's really not just Deutsche Bank that we have to worry about, because this gives you an idea of the 9 largest financial institutions in the world. These are their assets, including deposits, and these are the notional value of derivatives that they hold. These are football fields and tennis courts. There's the White House. Can you get an idea of it? Because the reality is it doesn't have to start with Deutsche Bank. Monte de Pesci that we've been talking about in the Flash M5s is going to be bailed out because an event at Monte de Pesci could transmit back to Deutsche Bank and then transmit around the globe. So those that were too big to fail, bail, and jail before are even bigger and more systemically important because there's even fewer banks in the system now than there were in 2008. Just a little more perspective on that, because these are the global derivatives. And in order for you to get a proper view, you take this whole red area here and multiply that times 100. And this is all of the money that flows through the global GDP. And 80%, almost 80% of all of these huge bets are related to interest rates. Can you see how they have transferred the risk? Just like what happened in 2008. It was their speculation that blew up the entire financial system. But rather than being punished for it and rather than suffering for it, they're bigger today. Their bonuses are bigger today. So they were rewarded for that speculation, and you and I are the ones, and everybody else, the public, is who's having to pay for that. Personally, I have a problem with that, because the truth is there is simply not enough wealth in the system to bail out all of those bets, period, end of discussion. And who is managing that? Wall Street. Really? And remember, Deutsche Bank alone has over 7,000 regulatory filings and litigations against them. And when our government wanted to issue a $14 billion fine for wrongdoing, that itself could have pushed them over. So yeah, they reduced the fine, postpone. Are they ready now? We'll know soon enough, I suppose.